They told her later that Eli had not spoken since his mother died. 3 months of silence. Through the packing of the wagon in St. Joseph, through the gray crossing of the Missouri River, through the endless flat miles of the Platte River Valley where the grass grew waist-high and the sky pressed down like a lid on something that would not stop boiling. His father had stopped trying to draw him out sometime around Fort Kearny. His brothers had stopped sometime before that. Eli Aldridge, 4 years old that April, had sealed himself shut like a letter no one was meant to read. So when he walked across the camp at dusk on the 28th of June, 1854, and pressed his face against the skirt of a woman he had never spoken to, a woman the rest of the wagon train had largely decided was more trouble than she was worth, no one was more startled than Nora Hale herself. She stood very still. She had learned, over a long and difficult life, that sudden movements frighten things that are only beginning to trust you. She looked down at the top of his head, the dark, unwashed curls, the small hands fisted in the fabric of her skirt, and she did not move. She did not speak. She just put one hand very gently against his back, felt the smallness of him, felt the way he breathed. That was the beginning of it. But the beginning of what exactly was something neither of them could have said. Nora Hale had joined the Harrington Party at Independence, Missouri, on the 14th of May, 1854, with a carpet bag, a cast-iron skillet, and a reference letter from a preacher in Cincinnati who had since died and could not be reached to confirm a word of it. She was 31 years old. She had been married once briefly to a man named George Hale who had taken sick with a chest fever in the winter of 1851 and left her with nothing but his name and a small debt she spent 2 years paying back at a boarding house on the east side of the city. She had no children of her own, no family left she could reach, an aunt in Albany she had not written to in 4 years, a brother somewhere in Kentucky who had made it clear the last time they parted that he was done making room for her in his life. She had not meant to go west, or rather, she had not meant anything in particular, which is its own kind of plan. What had happened was this. She had been working as a cook at Alderman's boarding house in Cincinnati when the man who owned the place decided to move his family to Oregon. He offered her a seat in the wagon, not as a member of the family which she had never been, but as a cook as she had always been, with the understanding that once they arrived in the Willamette Valley she would be paid a portion of what had been owed her for the last 2 years. It was not a generous arrangement, but it was an arrangement, and arrangements were what Nora Hale understood how to navigate. By the time the wagon train reached St. Joseph, the man had changed his mind about Oregon, though not about leaving Cincinnati, and had turned the entire party south toward Texas instead. He did not offer Nora the choice to come along. She did not ask if she might. She stood in St. Joseph, Missouri in the middle of May, with a carpet bag and a skillet and very little else, and she joined the Harrington Party because a woman named Bess Tilson, who was going to Oregon to meet a cousin she hadn't seen since they were girls, told her there was room in the supply wagon if she was willing to cook and willing to work. Nora was always willing to cook. It was the one skill she had that no one had ever been able to take from her. The Harrington Party was 43 people in 11 wagons when it pulled out of Independence. By Fort Kearny it was 39 people in 10 wagons, a fever having taken a grandmother and her infant granddaughter at the crossing of the Big Blue River, and a cracked wheel on the Robinsons' wagon forcing them to divide their goods among the others and walk the rest. Loss came fast on the trail, and it came without ceremony, and you learn to absorb it and keep moving. Nora had understood that before she arrived. What she had not understood was the particular silence that grief left behind, the way it sat in the wagons, invisible, for days afterward. She had noticed the Aldridge wagon on the 3rd day out of Independence. It was hard not to notice. Not because it was in poor condition. Thomas Aldridge ran a tight outfit, his wagon well balanced, and his team of 4 oxen among the strongest in the party, but because of the noise. 4 boys, ranging in age from 4 to 14, generated a quantity of chaos that seemed to exceed their numbers considerably. The two oldest, Caleb, who was 14 and already growing into the kind of serious, square-jawed young man that other men tend to burden with the tasks no one wants, and Henry, who was 11 and argumentative in the focused, principled way of someone who has not yet learned that winning arguments is often less valuable than letting them go, fought with each other constantly and loudly about everything and nothing. The middle boy, James, who was 8 and small for it, had adopted the particular strategy of provoking both older brothers and then retreating with an expression of wounded innocence that fooled absolutely no one. And Eli, the youngest, moved through all of it like a small, dark-eyed ghost, present, watching, utterly silent. Their mother had died in February. Nora learned this from Bess Tilson, who had learned it from Mrs. Harrington, who had learned it from the preacher at the send-off service in Independence. Childbed fever, after a delivery that had not produced a living child. Thomas Aldridge had waited out the worst of the winter grief, for himself and for 4 boys who were each learning, at different ages and in different ways, what it meant to lose the center of everything, and then had done what men of that era did when they had land already paid for and a plan already set in motion. He had gone anyway. Nora watched the Aldridge wagon from a careful distance for 2 weeks before she ever spoke to any of them directly. What she observed in those 2 weeks, Caleb had taken on the role of substitute mother with a grimness that no 14-year-old should have been required to carry. He cooked badly. The biscuits scorched, the bacon underdone, the coffee so thin it was barely colored water. But he cooked every single night without complaint, jaw set, eyes down, refusing every offer of help from the women of the party the way a man refuses help when he has decided that accepting it means admitting he cannot manage. He was wrong, of course, but he was 14 and grieving, and those two conditions together produce a stubbornness that is nearly impossible to argue with. Henry and James ate what was put in front of them and said nothing about the quality. Eli sometimes ate and sometimes did not, and no one could reliably predict which it would be on any given evening. Thomas Aldridge ate even less than Eli. He was perhaps 38 or 40. It was difficult to say because grief has a way of adding years to a man's face without adding them to his bones. He was broad through the shoulders, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that had once, she suspected, been inclined toward openness and had since learned a different expression. He drove the wagon and managed the oxen and spoke when spoken to and not much otherwise. At the evening camps he sat at the edge of the fire, a little apart from the other men, and sometimes he looked at his boys with an attention that was almost painful to witness, and sometimes he looked at nothing at all. Nora recognized that second look. She had seen it in her own mirror. The winter after George died, she filed it away and went on with her cooking, and said nothing. She offered to cook for them on the 21st of June, 3 days after the party crossed the South Platte River. The crossing had been difficult, the river running high and brown from snowmelt far away, one of the Harrington wagons taking on so much water that 3 barrels of flour were ruined and 2 crates of dry goods so soaked they had to be emptied and spread on the bank to dry, slowing the party nearly half a day. The whole camp was in a low mood that evening, damp and tired and counting losses and finding the count higher than they liked. Nora had made a pot of bean soup for herself and Bess. A good pot, thickened with a heel of salt pork and some dried onion she had wrapped carefully in cloth and carried from St. Joseph against exactly this kind of evening. She was lifting the ladle when she looked over at the Aldridge fire and saw Caleb, jaw set, burning the bottom of the cornbread again. She watched him for a moment. Then she picked up her pot and crossed the 20 feet of dry grass to the Aldridge fire. Without deciding to, the way you cross a room to steady something before you've consciously registered its falling. She had not prepared a speech. She did not have one. She said, "I have more soup than 2 people need. You'd be doing me a favor if you took some." Caleb looked up at her with an expression that was equal parts suspicion and exhaustion. He was too tired to argue and too hungry to refuse. He looked at the pot, he looked at her. He nodded once, without speaking. The boys came in from wherever they had scattered themselves around camp, Henry first, then James at a run, narrating his own arrival as if reporting to an audience, and they ate the soup in something closer to silence than Nora had yet observed from the Aldridge camp. Even Eli appeared, came close enough to the firelight to accept a bowl, his eyes somewhere near her chin, not quite reaching her face, and then retreated to the back of the wagon to eat it in private. She allowed this without comment. Thomas Aldridge had been checking the wheel rims when supper was put down. He came back to find 4 boys settled and a pot of soup considerably emptied. He looked at his sons, he looked at the pot. He looked at Nora, who was washing out the ladle with river water and minding her own business. "Thank you," he said. It came out stiff, like a door that hadn't been opened in a while. "No need," she said. "Too much for 2 people." He nodded and went to see to the oxen. She went back to Bess's wagon. Neither of them said anything further about it. She cooked for them again the next evening. And the evening after that, no agreement was reached. No words were exchanged on the subject. She simply appeared at the Aldridge fire around the time the sun touched the top of the bluffs to the west, and she cooked, and everyone ate, and she cleaned up and walked back to Bess Tilson's wagon. By the 5th evening, Caleb had stopped watching her from the corner of his eye as if she were about to pocket the salt. He had begun instead to simply help, passing things before she asked for them, banking the fire the right way, finding without being told the particular flat stone that worked best as a surface for rolling dough. He had the instincts of a natural cook, buried under 2 months of stress and no real instruction. She started explaining why she did things, not just the what, but the reasoning underneath, and she watched the small, involuntary light of understanding come on in his face and then be suppressed by the 14-year-old dignity that required him not to look like he was enjoying learning something. Henry had decided, with the total conviction of an 11-year-old who has found his purpose, that he was going to learn to make pie crust before the party reached Oregon. He applied himself to this project with more focused persistence than she had seen him apply to anything else on the trail. His first 3 attempts were disasters of different varieties. Too much water, then too little, then worked too long until the dough was tough as saddle leather. His 4th attempt was edible. She tasted it and said, "Better." He stood a little straighter for the rest of the evening. James talked through every meal and continued talking after it, a rushing commentary on everything he had observed that day at roughly 3 times the speed any person needed to absorb it. She had started, out of self-defense, to ask him actual questions, not the vague grown-up kind, but specific ones. What were the birds at the river exactly? Which color was the mud at the crossing today? He discovered that she was genuinely interested in the answers, and she discovered that underneath the torrent of words, James was paying close attention to everything. The birds, the plants, the precise way the terrain changed color as the trail moved west. He had the instincts of a naturalist, and the energy of someone who had not yet learned to contain himself, and she found that she enjoyed listening to him more than she had expected to. Eli watched from the wagon, always from the wagon, or from just beyond the circle of firelight. He watched her with the precise, unblinking attention of a small animal that has decided something is probably safe but is not yet prepared to commit to that conclusion. She did not push him. She learned quickly what he liked. He loved sweetness above everything else, would appear from his distance if she worked dried apple into the cornbread, or a spoonful of molasses into something, and she made sure there was always a portion for him, set at the edge of the fire where he could reach it without having to come fully into the light. She did not remark on this arrangement. Thomas Aldridge watched all of it, she was aware, in the way that she was aware of whether she wasn't looking at directly. He was not unhappy with what he saw. He was something she didn't yet have a name for. Something more complicated than happy or unhappy. Something more like a man who has been carrying a great weight and has just become aware that someone is standing near enough to help, and doesn't yet know whether to be grateful or afraid. At the end of most evenings, when the boys were bedded down and the fire had burned low, he would sit a while without speaking, and she would sit across from him, and neither of them would say much of anything. But it had become the comfortable kind of silence, the kind that has decided it doesn't need to account for itself. It was sometime around late June that the women of the party began to talk. Nora was aware of it the way she was aware of weather coming in before the clouds arrived. A shift in pressure, a change in the quality of certain glances, a phrase caught at the edge of a conversation that stopped when she came near. She understood the arithmetic as it would have appeared from outside. A single woman with no clear destination and no clear connections attaching herself, evening after evening, to the fire of a widower with 4 motherless boys. She understood why it looked the way it looked. Mrs. Harrington spoke to her about it directly, which Nora respected even if she didn't enjoy it. Mrs. Harrington was a careful woman, not unkind, but one who had learned that social talk cost money in ways that were difficult to recover from, particularly when you would be living alongside the same 40 people for another 3 months at close range. People are going to talk, Mrs. Harrington said. It might be better if you made things more proper. Nora asked what more proper would look like, specifically. Mrs. Harrington did not have a specific answer for that. What Nora did not say, she was not pursuing Thomas Aldridge. She was not pursuing anything. She was cooking because there were 4 children going underfed at the next wagon over, and cooking was what she knew how to do, and she was not constitutionally capable of watching a 14-year-old burn the cornbread for the 19th consecutive night when she could do something about it. What she also did not say, she had come to value the Aldridge fire in a way she had not anticipated and could not fully explain. The noise of it, the particular chaotic noise of 4 boys at different stages of becoming themselves, the way Caleb's shoulders sometimes dropped just slightly, on evenings when everything had gone right, as if he were setting down something he carried the rest of the time. The way James's observations tumbled over each other and filled a silence that would otherwise have been too large. The way Henry stood a fraction taller when he got something right. The way Eli's dark eyes tracked her from the wagon, carefully, like someone memorizing a route back to a place they were not yet certain they were allowed to go. She was not going to say any of that to Mrs. Harrington. Thomas Aldridge came to find her on the evening of the 25th of June. She was at Bess's wagon, sitting on an upturned crate mending a tear in her second dress by firelight, when she heard boots in the dry grass and looked up. He was standing at the edge of the light, holding his hat in both hands by the brim. She had learned by then that this was what he did when he was working up to something difficult. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "I need to speak with you." She set down the mending and waited. He said it plainly, which she respected, because plainness was something she could work with. People were talking. It wasn't right, to her reputation, or to the memory of his wife, or to his boys who were watching everything and drawing their own conclusions, to continue as they had been going. He had spoken to Captain Harrington. There was a family toward the back of the train, the Connollys, who needed help with their wagon and would be glad to have a cook. He held his hat by the brim and looked at a point just above her left shoulder. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is the food bad?" He blinked. "No." "Are your boys unhappy?" A pause. "No." "Are you unhappy with the arrangement?" A longer pause. "Mrs. Hale, I'm asking you directly," she said. "I find it saves time." He looked at her then, for the first time since he had started speaking. His eyes in the firelight were a dark gray that was almost blue when there was enough warmth behind it. He said quietly, "No, I am not unhappy with it." "Then," she said, and picked up her mending again, "I'd suggest we let the Connollys find their own cook. If you don't want me at your fire, tell me so plainly and I'll stop without complaint. But don't tell me it's for my reputation. I'm 31 years old, and I'll decide what's good for my reputation myself." Thomas Aldridge stood at the edge of the firelight for a long moment. Then he put his hat back on and said, "Good night, Mrs. Hale," and walked back across the dark grass toward his wagon. She came back to the Aldridge fire the next evening. He said nothing to suggest she shouldn't. The wagon train reached Chimney Rock on the 6th of July. That great gray spike of stone rising out of the Nebraska plain like a finger pointing at something only the sky could see, and the whole party fell quiet when it came into view. It had that effect. Every emigrant who passed it seemed compelled to write something down, to note the date and the site, as if some part of them understood that this was a landmark in more than just the geographical sense. It was evidence that the journey was real. James spent the entire morning of their approach composing a detailed verbal inventory of the rock's dimensions, geological characteristics, and general impressiveness, delivering this inventory to anyone within earshot whether or not they had requested it. Henry bet Caleb that he could hit the base of it with a stone thrown from the trail. He could not, but this did not visibly diminish his confidence in the theory. Even Eli came out of the wagon to look at it, standing in the front of the wagon bed beside his father, watching the rock grow as they approached with an expression of solemn and particular interest. Thomas, walking the oxen, looked over his shoulder and found all 4 boys looking at the rock and nobody fighting with anybody. He caught Nora's eye across the distance between the wagons with an expression that was the closest she had seen him come to lightness. That evening at camp, she told Henry, because he had been asking questions about her cooking for weeks now, and she had been giving him answers in portions, the way you give a hungry person food after a long fast, that she would teach him to make biscuits that didn't split wrong, he said, with the elaborate disinterest of a child who wants something very much. I suppose I could try. She worked with him for an hour after supper while the others settled down. She showed him the ratio of fat to flour. She showed him why the fat had to be cold, worked in quickly, not kneaded. The way the dough should feel, soft but not sticky, firm but not stiff, a distinction that has to be learned through the hands and cannot be communicated in words. He scorched the first batch slightly. The second batch was right. She heard him later, in the wagon, telling James in the low, serious voice of someone conveying information of the highest importance, "The fat has to be cold. That's the main thing." She said so. She did not let him see her smile. 2 nights after Chimney Rock, she and Thomas had the longest conversation they had yet managed. It happened because James had finally run out of words sometime around the dinner fire and fallen asleep mid-sentence, and Henry and Caleb had retreated to the wagon to argue in lower voices than usual, and Eli was in his corner with his eyes closed, and the fire was comfortable. Neither of them had anywhere to be. Thomas asked her where she had learned to cook the way she did. She told him, her mother's kitchen in Ohio, then a neighbor's kitchen after her mother died, then every employer's kitchen after that, learning something different from each of them and keeping what was worth keeping. He asked what the best thing was that she'd learned. She thought about it. That food done right is a form of care, she said. People know, when they eat something that someone made carefully, that someone was thinking of them. They might not say so. They might not even know that's what they're feeling. But they know. He was quiet for a while after that. Then he said, "Margaret cooked that way, my wife." Pause. She made everything carefully, even when she was exhausted, even when there wasn't much to work with. I used to tell her she didn't have to go to the trouble, and she'd say, he stopped. Something moved across his face. She'd say, "Of course I do. They're my people." Nora said nothing. "I miss that," Thomas said. Not just the food, the being thought of. She watched the fire for a moment. Then she said quietly, "You're being thought of now." She said it without looking at him, and she went back to Bess's wagon shortly after, and neither of them mentioned it again. But something had been named that had been present for a while without a name, and named things have a way of becoming more real. They crossed the Continental Divide at South Pass on the 22nd of July, 7,400 feet of elevation, the highest point on the entire trail, and the day was so clear it felt like a gift the country was handing out without explanation. The air was thin and cold, and the light at that altitude was extraordinary, the kind of high mountain light that makes everything appear more precisely itself, as if the world has been sharpened. James ran ahead of the wagon for a quarter mile, and then ran back to report on what the trail looked like from in front. Henry walked beside Caleb without arguing, which Nora had come to understand was Henry's highest expression of contentment. Caleb walked with his hands in his pockets, and his face turned up toward the light in a way she had not seen from him before. Relaxed, young, like something had been set down temporarily that he was usually required to carry. And Eli had gotten down from the wagon. He was walking, 10 feet behind the others, with the careful, deliberate stride of a very small person who has decided to do something and is going to do it without drawing attention to the fact. She watched him from the corner of her eye and said nothing about it. He just walked. Thomas fell into step beside her somewhere past the summit marker. He walked in silence for a while, as was his habit, and then said, "Margaret would have liked this. The high country. What was she like? Nora asked. He thought about it the way he thought about everything worth saying. Stubborn, he said. Funny. She was very funny. He wouldn't have known it to look at her. Small woman, very composed, everything proper. And then something would come out of her, and the room would change. He stopped. Something crossed his face that was grief and warmth inseparable. The two things so long together they had stopped being distinguishable. She didn't suffer fools. She had a clear eye. I try to be kinder than that, Nora said. No, you don't, Thomas said. And a smile, a real one, brief and involuntary, crossed his face. She laughed. The real laugh. The one that came without permission, that she hadn't heard from herself in a long time. That evening, James declared that when he grew up, he was going to come back to South Pass and build a house there to live on top of the world. Caleb said that was the stupidest plan he had ever heard. Henry said he would help with the construction and had some thoughts about the foundation. And Eli, sitting only 8 feet from the fire now, closer than he had ever voluntarily come, looked up briefly from whatever he was watching, and what was on his face barely was the beginning of a smile. This was the high point. Nora would recognize it in retrospect. The moment when the story seemed, briefly, to have arrived at something good. It had not arrived. It was only resting. The Snake River crossing happened on the 9th of August. The men had discussed it in low voices the night before, and Nora had heard enough from where she sat at Bess's wagon to understand the tone of it. The Snake was wide and cold and running fast from the mountains, and it had a reputation that was earned. The water was glacial clear over a gravel bottom that was deeper than it looked and in places uneven enough to catch a wagon wheel and hold it. Caleb came to find her the evening before the crossing. He was 14 and working very hard not to appear frightened, which produced the particular expression of someone who is frightened in a controlled way. He stood at the edge of the firelight and said, without preamble, "Mrs. Hale, will you ride in our wagon for the crossing tomorrow?" She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, quickly, and went back to his wagon. She understood that he had not told his father he was going to ask her, and she honored that by not mentioning it to Thomas either. She was on the driver's bench beside Thomas when the wagon entered the water the next morning. The cold came up through the boards immediately, the kind of cold that clarifies things, that makes everything more present. She could see the bottom clearly in the shallower sections, the pale gravel moving slightly in the current, the wagon wheels pushing small fans of water to either side. Thomas had the ox lines in both hands and was watching the water ahead with absolute concentration. His hands on the lines were steady. She had learned to read him by his hands. In the back she could hear the boys. James, quiet for once. She did not think she had ever heard James quiet for this long before. Henry, counting something under his breath, perhaps the seconds, perhaps something of his own invention that helped. Caleb, steady, and Eli had not made a sound all morning. They were halfway across when the rear right wheel hit a submerged rock. The impact came up through the bench like a blow. The wagon lurched hard to the right, the oxen staggered and then held, and Thomas's hands on the lines went white at the knuckles. The wagon righted, but not before something shifted violently in the wagon bed, and James shouted. She was through the opening into the wagon bed before she had decided to move. James had slid 2 feet toward the low side and grabbed the rail. Henry had him. Caleb was riding a barrel that had tipped, his shoulder against it, feet braced. Everything manageable. She took it in less than a second and then looked for Eli. He was in the far back corner, pressed against the wooden wall, eyes closed, both hands flat on the boards on either side of him as if feeling for something solid in a world that had stopped being solid. She moved to him. She put her arms around him. And he was so small, she was always slightly struck by how small he was, how much weight the world had put on something this small. And she pressed her mouth close to his ear and said, under the sound of the water and the oxen and the creak of the wagon, "I've got you. Don't look, just hold on." He gripped the front of her dress with both fists so tightly she felt his knuckles through the fabric. The wagon came out of the water on the far bank with a shuddering lurch and then was still. For a long time after, even after Thomas had the oxen stopped and the boys were talking over each other, and someone on the bank was calling that they'd made it. For a long time Eli did not let go. She did not ask him to. 3 days after the Snake River, Caleb took sick. It came on fast, as fevers did on the trail, fine at supper, chilled by midnight, burning by morning. Nora had seen enough trail illness to read the signs quickly. This was not the kind that passed in a day with rest and water. This was the kind that needed watching through the night. She sat with him through the first night. Thomas sat on the other side, and they were 2 people on either side of a narrow sickbed in a stopped wagon that smelled of canvas and camphor, and neither of them slept. The camp was quiet around them. The Snake River plain was flat and enormous in the darkness beyond the wagon canvas, and somewhere far off, wolves were calling. By the second morning, the fever had climbed higher, and Caleb was talking without sense, fragments of things disconnected. His mother's name, once. Something about a dog they had apparently owned in Missouri that she had not known about. Thomas's face had gone the color of bleached stone. "He's young," Nora said. It was 2 in the morning, and the wagon was still, and the rest of the camp was asleep. "Young and strong, that matters," Thomas said. His mother was young. She did not pretend he hadn't said it. She did not offer him the meaningless comfort of contradiction. "I know," she said. "I know what you're afraid of. I'm afraid of it too." He looked at her. "I can't." He stopped. His hands were on his knees, which was wrong. His hands were always doing something, always moving, checking, managing. To see them still was to understand how frightened he was underneath the steadiness he kept for his boys. "I don't know what I would do if—" He stopped again. She reached across the narrow space between them and put her hand over his. Not a declaration, not a promise, just, "I am here. Here is the weight of one hand. You are not alone in this." He turned his hand over and held hers back, and they sat that way through the rest of the night, listening to Caleb's breathing, watching for the change, not speaking because there was nothing to say that the silence didn't already hold. Before dawn, the fever broke. She felt the moment of it, the shift in his breathing, the cooling sweat, the way the rigid line of his body softened by degrees. Thomas put his free hand over his face and made a sound that was the sound of a man crying who had spent a long time forgetting how, the sound of relief arriving in a person who has held themselves together past the point of endurance. She held on and did not look away. Caleb slept for 12 hours. When he woke, he was pale and thin and entirely himself, and the first thing he said was that he was hungry. She went to make him something, and when she brought it back, he said, without preamble, looking at the food rather than at her, "Thank you, Mrs. Hale, for staying." "Of course," she said. He nodded and ate, and that was the whole of it. But it was also entirely sufficient. Something had shifted between Nora and Thomas after that night, in the way that things shift between people who have been through something together at 2 in the morning when neither of them could pretend to be anything other than what they were. Nothing was said about it. Nothing was decided. But the quality of the silence between them had changed. It had weight in it now, and warmth, and something she was going to have to make a decision about at some point. She was aware that she was not being careful anymore. That she had, somewhere between the Snake River and the Blue Mountains, stopped treating this as a temporary arrangement she was passing through and started treating it as her life. This frightened her more than the river crossing had. She had not had a life in a long time. She had had arrangements. Arrangements were safe. They ended when they needed to end, and you moved on to the next one, and nothing was lost that you hadn't already accounted for losing. A life was different. A life had rooms in it, and people, and the specific weight of things you would not choose to live without. She lay awake one night in the Blue Mountains listening to the wind in the firs and made herself look at it directly. 4 boys she had come to love in the specific, exasperated, grateful way you love people who do not make it easy, and a man who noticed how she liked the morning light and had thought, quietly, about which direction to face a house. She breathed in the cold mountain air. She had been afraid of worse things. The evening Eli came to find her was the 28th of August. She had to count back in her diary to be certain, because by then the days had folded into each other in the particular way they did in the final stretch of the trail, where everyone was tired and everyone was close and everyone was simply trying to arrive. The camp was settling into its evening quiet. She had finished with supper and was sitting a little apart from the Aldridge fire, giving the boys room to wind down, listening to James deliver his nightly summary of observed phenomena and Henry interject corrections. The Blue Mountains were dark against the evening sky behind them, and ahead, somewhere, was the Willamette Valley and the end of the road they had been walking since May. She heard footsteps in the dry grass. Small footsteps, careful. She looked down. Eli stood in front of her. He was 4 years old. He had his mother's dark curls and his father's grave, considering eyes and a smudge of ash on his left cheek that she could see in the firelight. He had not spoken a word in 6 months. He had not allowed anyone to touch him except for those minutes in the wagon at the Snake River crossing, which neither of them had referred to since. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes moving over her face the way he looked at everything, making sure of it, storing it, deciding. Then he walked forward and pressed his face against her skirt. She went very still. She put one hand very gently against his back, felt him breathe, felt the small, warm, specific weight of him. She looked up. Thomas was standing 10 feet away. He had been crossing toward the fire when it happened, and he had stopped. His face held something she had no single word for. Not quite joy, though joy was in it. Not quite grief, though grief was in it too. The expression of someone watching something arrive that they had stopped daring to expect. She looked back down at Eli. After a long moment, barely audible, his face still pressed into the fabric of her skirt, she heard a single word. Stay. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, Thomas was still standing in the same place, watching her. And she knew in the particular way that you know things that have been true for some time before you admit them, the way you know the season has changed before you can name exactly when it happened, that the word had not come only from Eli. She put her other arm around the boy and held him, felt him settle. All right, she said quietly. All right. They were married at the Dalles on the 12th of October, 1854. In a ceremony so brief and practical, it was over before James had finished figuring out where to stand. The preacher had seen enough trail weddings not to make more of them than the people needed. A handful of words, the right questions, the right answers. Thomas had a ring he had been carrying since Fort Hall in his coat pocket without telling her. She did not ask when he had acquired it. She put it on, and it fit, more or less, which she took as sufficient evidence of rightness. Henry made the pie. It was the best pie he had made. She tasted it and told him so, specifically because by then she understood that Henry needed the specific truth. General praise washed off him like water, but a precise and accurate statement about something he had worked for stayed with him. Caleb shook her hand with both of his very formally and said, "Welcome to the family," then looked immediately away, and she understood that this was Caleb's version of weeping with relief, and she received it accordingly and said nothing about his expression. James gave her a rock. He produced it from his pocket with the gravity of someone presenting something of considerable value, which he was. He had found it at South Pass in July and carried it ever since because it was, as he explained, the exact color of nothing else he had ever seen. A particular grayish blue that was entirely its own thing. She held it in her palm and looked at it. She could believe that. She put it in her pocket, and Eli stood next to her throughout the ceremony with his hand in hers. He had started talking 6 days after the evening he came to her at the fire. Not in a flood, because Eli was not a flood kind of person, but in a careful trickle, one word at a time, as if testing each one before committing to it. He told her the names of 3 birds he had been watching for weeks. He told her the oxen smelled different in the mountains than they had on the plains. He told her he had saved a piece of dried apple from supper in case she was hungry. She ate the dried apple and told him it was the best piece of dried apple she had ever had. He regarded her with his dark, considering eyes and said, "I know." She laughed so hard she had to sit down, and he looked at her with an expression of dignified satisfaction, and she thought, "There it is. There is the thing that was sealed shut. There it is, opening." They arrived in Oregon City on the 21st of October, 1854. Thomas had a land claim filed, 160 acres in the Willamette Valley, good river-fed ground with stands of Douglas fir on the east side, and a meadow that, a neighbor told them, came entirely to wildflowers every spring. No house yet. A site where a house would be, some timber already cut, and the work of it spread out before them in a way that was daunting and also, she found, exhilarating. Nora stood in the meadow on the first morning and looked out over it. The open sky going blue at the edges where it met the mountains, the dark line of firs, the brown grass going to frost at the stems, the particular quiet of a piece of land that has not yet had a life built on it. She breathed in the cold air. It smelled like fir trees and wet soil and something she didn't have a word for. Something that was the smell of the end of a very long journey. Thomas came to stand beside her. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the same things. Then he said, "We'll build it facing east, so you get the light in the morning." She looked at him. "That's how you like it," he said. "The morning light." I noticed. She looked back at the meadow. "We'll need a bigger fireplace than you're probably planning," she said, "for the kind of winters they have here." I was thinking the same thing, and a shelf in the kitchen high up, where James cannot reach it. Or Henry. Henry is becoming very creative about baked goods. He smiled. "South wall?" "South wall," she said. They stood there in the brown meadow making the house in the air with words, the way people do when they have the whole of something new in front of them and are only beginning to understand the scale of what they've been given. Behind them the boys were unloading the wagon, James narrating, Henry supervising with tremendous authority, Caleb doing most of the actual work with the quiet efficiency that was simply now who he was. And Eli had climbed to the top of the front wheel of the wagon and was sitting there in the October light, looking out over the valley below with his dark, careful eyes, adding it to an inventory that she suspected he would carry with him always. She watched him for a moment. Then she turned back to the meadow and the mountains and the unbuilt house, and she thought about the letter she had not been able to bring herself to write for 3 years. The one to her aunt in Albany, the one that would have had to explain where she had ended up, and how, and whether it had been worth it. She thought about what that letter would say now. She thought it would begin, "I have arrived somewhere I did not plan for." And it turns out that was the right kind of planning all along. She thought it would end simply, with a rock in her pocket the color of nothing else she'd seen, with 4 boys and a man who noticed how she liked the light, with the particular smell of this meadow on this October morning, which was the smell of everything she was going to keep. She kept that thought, and the meadow, and the sound of her family behind her, and she breathed in the cold Oregon air one more time. It smelled like fir trees and mud, and the end of something very long. It smelled like the beginning of everything.